I got the chance to drive some of the quirkiest cars at the SMMT test day, so here's a look at 4 of them. This is the BYD Atto 3, a remarkably cheap and remarkably impressive sort of, well, fully electric SUV. This is the design trim, the highest spec, and this has the 150 kilowatt motor and the 60.5 kilowatt hour battery. My immediate first impressions, and admittedly this is the SMMT test day and therefore you're only going to get some first impressions here, is that this is remarkably nice. This is incredibly well equipped. The central display is the sort of Tesla style massive touchscreen, but it is a remarkably responsive and insanely sort of fast and impressive display, plenty of settings, and even the entire display rotates. I know it's potentially a little bit of a gimmick, but you know, that's rather impressive. And the overall sort of first impression is, while it is definitely on the cheaper side, it's still quite nice in here. As you might expect for an EV, things like regen braking work rather nicely. It's actually relatively strong, and what I would mention is that you have in the center console the ability to change the regen sort of force. You can turn it down. I'm currently on the high mode, but you can turn it down to standard and to well, currently just standard apparently, although we are also in eco mode, which restricts the throttle input a little bit. You can change the mode with the dial next to that, so switching into sport should give you a little bit more pep when you floor it, which I can confirm it does. Okay, so the good news is that the acceleration is pretty decent. I even got wheel spin on the front, which is kind of surprising, but yeah, we got up to speed decently. It's obviously not as fast as, you know, a number of the higher performance EVs, but it's not bad. Of course, one of the things that people care the most about with EVs is their range and efficiency. We currently have 92% charge in the battery, and the trip computer here reckons 240 miles, which doesn't sound too bad, although it is worth noting that when we took a look at the static model, that you've hopefully seen some footage of already, that had, first of all, a load of tech in the on the infotainment screen. There was a load of different parking assistance, driving assistance, lane keep assist, all that sort of stuff, which is remarkably impressive. But also, it had a load of stats about how that car had been driving. And because that was a static model, that was just driven their miles rather than the sort of driving that we're doing, which is potentially a little bit harsher on it. And that was reckoning that it had either 29 kilowatt hours per 100 miles, or more like 15 or so. 15 makes that a lot more of an impressive and efficient machine, whereas 29 is less impressive, especially considering that this is only a 60 or 60.5 kilowatt hour battery. One thing that you might have noticed here is that the road noise is actually relatively loud when you're up at speed. We're only doing 60 right now, and it's not unbearable or anything, but it definitely feels like a more budget car. There's definitely less sound deadening than perhaps you might like for a car that, at least in this trim and this model, costs just shy of £39,000. Interestingly, one of the things in the instrument cluster here is that it shows you how much power you're deploying at any given time, both in acceleration and in regen braking. And because you can change the modes, both the driving modes and the regen modes, I was just having a little play, and it looks like when driving at about 60 miles an hour, when you let off the accelerator and it starts regen braking, you get about 30 to 35 kilowatts of power input to the battery, versus when you're more like 40 miles an hour, it's more like 20, 25 kilowatts. And obviously the slower you go, the less power you're recouping. Although I would mention that the regen braking isn't quite as strong as some other cars that I've tested. It's fine, but it's not, you really would have to properly plan out that you're going to be stopping, in quite a while, and so you start lifting off. And while it does slow down, it's not that sort of full replacement for the friction brakes. You definitely are still going to use these friction brakes, even if less than you would in a conventional internal combustion engine car. And I thought I should mention some of the other quirks and features, like the fact that this has an air source heat pump, which is great for efficiency, especially in the colder months. You also get relatively fast charging, and you can even have an optional 11 kilowatt home charger included as well. Seeing as we've gone over a number of bumps on this route, I must mention that the suspension is still quite nice. It's relatively soft, it does support the car fairly well, although it does kind of have quite a lot of body roll to it, even with the active body roll sort of checks built in, or the feature built in, but it's nice enough. It handles decently well for a car of this height and weight, so I'm not too worried about it, but yeah, it's nice, it's comfortable. This is definitely a quirky car, and certainly not one that you would normally find, but it's interesting. It didn't need to be an SUV, but it's interesting. So this is the IONIQ 6. Not the 5. This is a lot lower to the ground, it's a lot longer, and it's a coupe instead of a hatchback. The lower sort of seating position and general weight being lower means that this feels a lot more sporty. It feels a lot less like it wants to roll over this edge, and it's got a pretty decent grip too. Oh, and it goes. It goes. It does have a lot of driver aids, so I'm sorry if you hear a lot of bonking and, you know, bings. I can't help that. But wow, this thing feels good. Who needs a sport version when you have this? Also, I've set it on the maximum regen, and the regen actually feels good on this. It really, like, I'm still using the friction brakes a little bit, but it really brakes hard, which is what I would want in an EV like this. And let's go up the hill full throttle. It's not quite as fast as my S4, but it's not that far off.
Correct.
Whoa, it pulls! Oh, that is really good. I like this a lot. Oh, this feels a lot more sporty than the IONIQ 5. Just because of that lower center of gravity, it feels so much better. Oh, that's good. It brakes! It's not a Mercedes EQS! It's giving me a collision warning, for fuck's sake. Okay, so we've had the blast in the on the hill route. Let me slow down, do the city route, and tell you a bit more about the car. So we have a 77 kilowatt hour battery, which should give you a pretty decent range. We currently have 75% charge, and the range estimate is 198 miles. It's basically the same as the IONIQ 5, although in theory, because this is a shorter car and a bit more of a sleek profile, you should actually get slightly better range in this. Although the 228 horsepower that this has might also change that a bit, because you put your foot down and have a lot of fun. And because it's rear-wheel drive, that's why you get a lot of fun out of this. Also, you get 350 Newton meters of torque, and because it's electric, that is instant. And so again, this is a very, very fun, at least sort of, you know, city car, and a little bit around the, you know, your surrounding countryside area. But yeah, I really dislike the bongs, and I'm sorry that I can't turn them off. I must admit, for this sort of city driving, this is working really well. The steering is really light, even in the sport mode, and it feels quite nice, it feels quite comfortable. It's a nice place to be. It's certainly a more premium cabin than you might be used to in the more budget EVs. I've also set it to the maximum regen, which does mean that it comes to a complete stop. I've got both feet off the pedals and we're at a complete stop. You do just have to accelerate to make it move, and it will come to a complete stop on its own as well, which is quite nice. It's also worth noting just how much tech and just how many little LED pixels there are everywhere. In the steering wheel, when you change the driving mode, that changes the RGB LEDs in the steering wheel. You can also see them on the outside. You have the actually rather nice both instrument cluster driver's display and the central console, which is two separate displays, but in one housing. Looks very nice, very premium. The materials in here are also quite nice. It's not necessarily, you know, it's not Rolls-Royce quality, but I'm pretty happy in here. Well, we only have limited time to drive these cars, so I can't give you too much in the way of extra details. I can tell you that, like I said, this is a nice place to be, and I hope to have one of these in the not too distant future, so hopefully you'll be able to see a full review of this in at least the next couple months or so. This is a VW ID Buzz, one of the quirkiest cars on test here, because it's not really a car, it's a van. Except this is the ID Buzz People, which is essentially the camper van variant. The styling on this very much harks back to the original, split window VW campers, and a lot of people like it, and I think I might be one of them. Now, to be clear, I don't think that anyone needs an SUV, nor needs this as their everyday vehicle, but if you do want a camper van, I mean, this seems like quite a nice one. This is the same platform as the VW ID3, ID4, ID5. It's the same motors and battery, all that sort of stuff. It's, nicely tucked under the floor. You still have plenty of go, which is obviously good, especially for a big bus like this. You, of course, have plenty of room in the back, and it's actually quite a nice semi-refined experience in here. It's not all that loud, which is kind of remarkable considering that this is a big open space. It's not echoey in here, which I was expecting, and it's quite nice. It rides quite nicely. I mean, we're doing the hill route of Millbrook because that's the only one that we're allowed on for some reason, and it's perfectly fine. It's not exactly the fastest vehicle, compared to like the IONIQ 6 that we drove a little earlier, but it's certainly handling itself all right. It's not rolling. There's remarkably very little body roll. Like, of course, you're big up high. I'm not that comfortable going quickly in this thing, but it does seem relatively capable, which is kind of surprising for a big bus like this. It's literally called the Buzz, as in the bus. I've just switched it into the B mode, the brake mode, the one pedal driving mode, which I think is where you should leave this the majority of the time. And I think that's where this thing makes more sense, right? You have a sort of people carrier and van, essentially, that is still remarkably capable, still perfectly nippy. You can still, get up to speed on the motorway just fine. I'm sure even with, cargo and or passengers on board. And it's relatively comfortable. It's not, lumping us around too hard. The suspension is still relatively soft considering the weight. And so it's kind of nice in here. The regen braking feels really good. We're going down an insanely steep hill and we're still slowing at about the same speed as you would if you were pushing on standard conventional brakes. So I'm pretty happy with that in terms of the driving experience. What's also impressive is actually the visibility. The windscreen is remarkably far away from me, but the front edge of the vehicle is basically where the windscreen sits, so it's quite maneuverable. You also have great visibility all around, big wing mirrors, plenty of view out the back, and plenty of overall visibility. All of the pillars are, well, decently sized, but I mean, even the front A pillar is actually further away, and then you have a separate piece of glass up front, and then you have what is essentially your B pillar, but would normally be your A pillar, and that's relatively small, so generally great visibility. The only thing to mention is that because we're so high, it can be difficult to see small things like pedestrians, especially children, so do be aware of that when you're driving your ID Buzz. As for interior tech, because this is the same as the ID3, 4, 5, you still get the minuscule little instrument cluster that's just too small. You do still have the central infotainment system, which is fine. You still got touch controls and things, which again, fine, but it's still nice enough, and I'm pretty happy in here. The overall fit and finish quality, again, it's pretty similar to the ID3, 4, 5, so you're not going to see anything too majorly new with this, but it's still nice enough. You've got the fake wood trim, which is just plastic, which is kind of sad, but it's nice enough in here. And this is the MG4, a rather quirky little hatchback, full EV of course, and it's one of the cheaper cars on test on the SMMT day here. It's also remarkably kind of nice. It's pretty nippy as well, with either 170 or a little over 200 horsepower, depending on which model you get, and you get either a 51 kilowatt battery or a 64 kilowatt battery, again depending on the model, whether you get the SE long range or the standard SE or the trophy variant. This is the SE variant, and it's pretty nippy. You got, obviously being electric, plenty of torque, but it feels pretty fast. It's also just a little hatchback. It's not an SUV, which is rather nice, and means that the handling, even on this rather fancy off-road course, sort of hill route course at Millbrook, it feels pretty good here. The brakes are not confidence inspiring. Like, obviously they work just fine, but going down that rather steep hill and, you know, going relatively quickly down the hill too, I was pushing a little bit harder, I wasn't getting much feedback, so it's not what I would call a performance car, to make that clear, but for your everyday, you know, city car and even potentially just your everyday car, it's pretty decent, it's pretty nippy, you'll get up to speed just fine, and as long as you're careful with the brakes, you can have a bit of fun on some country lanes on your journeys too. Despite this being a much more budget vehicle, the interior is still quite nice. You have these fabric seats which do hold me fairly well, and I'm relatively wide and they're not too bad. There's the overall material finish is definitely on the cheaper side, but it's not glaringly obvious. Everything that I'm touching still feels, you know, nice enough, even if it's not ultra premium quality. It looks like you have a decent amount of space in the back. It's not exactly the longest, largest car, but you've got plenty of room up front, the back looks okay, and you even have a bit of room in the boot too. It's definitely a more practical car than some others, and because it's a hatchback, it does mean that it is even more practical, and I quite like that. I would say that, I mean, you can hear things like the road noise, even the motor can shudder when you're regen braking sometimes, so there are a few areas of refinement that clearly haven't been done here, but on the whole, it's not bad, and especially when you see the price tag of this thing, you'll understand why I'm more forgiving in my my experience with it than I would be in, say, an IONIQ 5 or 6. The infotainment screen looks nice enough. You've got a couple of options. I don't like that the driving modes are in the infotainment screen and the text is tiny. That's the sort of thing that I would want a button on the steering wheel or somewhere in this sort of central console to be able to easily, you know, change. There might be one here. Obviously, this is a really short test drive, so I can't exactly tell you, but you know, it'd be nice if that was a little larger. No, this is nice enough, and especially for the price tag, I can't argue. You've got a decent, if again, still pretty small, you know, instrument cluster. All the switchgear and stuff feels nice enough. Again, it's more on the budget side, but I can't really complain. And that is pretty much it for this video. If you're interested in seeing more car, you know, first drives and reviews like this, there are quite a few on the channel already, and I also hope to get a few of these cars like the IONIQ 5 and 6 and the MG4 in relatively short order, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss those. Otherwise, feel free to check out plenty of the videos on the end cards. If you want to, you know, support the channel, you can pick up a hoodie or t-shirt like the one I'm wearing in the description. And that's kind of it. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you on the next video.